assuming we receive regulatory approval to do so, we'll attempt to catch the ship with the tower on the next flight, which is tentatively scheduled for the end of this month.
SpaceX will make some serious history this month. On the surface, Flight 14 might look like just another test flight of its massive Starship vehicle, but I'm promising you, Starship Flight 14 could be unlike anything we've seen before. Because the craziest part isn't even the ship catch, it is something that comes before that. Something that could have a huge impact on how Starship missions are flown in the future. Starship Flight Test 14 is set to be the third test flight of SpaceX's new Block 3 vehicles, with Booster 21 and Ship 41 taking the starring roles. The special thing about Ship 41 is that it gets to attempt something no Starship has done before, actually going orbital and then coming back to Earth to be caught by the giant Mechazilla tower. So let's look at the first half. Now, going to space and going into orbit are not the same thing. A spacecraft can climb high enough to reach space, coast along for a while, and then come crashing back down to Earth. That's called a suborbital trajectory. You've technically gone to space, but you haven't actually gone fast enough to keep going around the planet. And that's the key difference. Height gets you into space, but speed keeps you there. For a typical low Earth orbit, a spacecraft needs to travel at roughly 7.8 kilometers per second, or around 28,000 kilometers per hour. And the funny thing is, most of that speed isn't being used to go higher. It's being used to go sideways really, really fast. It's like throwing a ball. Throw it gently, and it hits the ground nearby. Throw it harder, and it travels farther before falling. In theory, if you could throw it fast enough, the ground would curve away underneath it at exactly the same rate the ball is falling. Congratulations, you've invented an orbit. Starship has so far stopped short of completing that final step. Across its first 13 integrated flight tests, the vehicle has flown suborbital or transatmospheric trajectories. The ship reaches space, travels along a long arc, and eventually re-enters the atmosphere before splashing down, usually in the Indian Ocean. That doesn't mean Starship hasn't gotten extremely fast. Several flights, particularly beginning with Flight 3, reached speeds in the neighborhood of 7.3 to 7.4 kilometers per second, getting surprisingly close to the speed needed for orbit. SpaceX has described this as achieving orbital velocity while deliberately flying a suborbital trajectory. In other words, Starship has already been practicing the go really, really fast part. It just hasn't used that speed to complete a full trip around Earth. And that distinction matters because reaching orbital velocity is only part of the problem. To actually stay in orbit, Starship needs to manage a whole series of things that all have to work at exactly the right time. The engines need to perform through the full ascent burn, shut down precisely, and then potentially restart in space for orbital maneuvers, circularization, and eventually the deorbit burn. And restarting a giant methane engine in space is obviously a little more complicated than restarting your car after you forgot why you turned it off in the first place. Starship has already demonstrated in-space Raptor relights on recent flights, which is a major step forward. But doing it reliably as part of an actual orbital mission is a much bigger test. Now, did you know that hitting that subscribe button is actually easier than relighting an engine in space? It only takes a second, but it helps make sure you never miss the latest and coolest things happening in spaceflight. Okay, so now that our Starship has actually reached orbit, how does it make its way back to Starbase at exactly the right place and time for Mechazilla to catch it? A lot of people assume Flight 14 could be roughly a one-orbit mission. Starship launches, reaches orbit, goes around Earth once, comes back towards Starbase, and then the tower catches it. Since one orbit takes roughly 90 to 100 minutes, you might initially think the whole mission could last around 2 hours. And that actually gives SpaceX quite a bit of time to set everything up for the catch. The chopsticks could catch the booster and place it back on the launch mount. Then the tower would have time to reposition itself and get ready for the returning ship. So, in theory, there could be more than 90 minutes for the tower to reset before Starship comes back around. But there's a problem with this idea. Starship can't necessarily just complete one orbit and come straight back to Starbase. Now, why is that? Imagine Starbase as a single dot painted on the surface of a giant rotating Earth. Starship launches from that dot and enters orbit. As it travels around Earth, it follows its orbital path through space. Now, after roughly 90 minutes, Starship has completed one orbit and comes back around to almost the same part of its path in space. The key word here is almost. The Earth has been rotating underneath that orbit the entire time, so Starbase has moved. It's no longer necessarily sitting directly underneath Starship's trajectory when the spacecraft comes back around. If you're throwing a ball straight up while standing on a slowly rotating merry-go-round, the ball follows its own path through the air, but while it's in the air, the ground underneath it keeps moving. That's basically the same problem Starship has to deal with. Because Starship's orbit would take roughly 91 minutes, during that time, the Earth rotates by roughly 22 degrees. Now, that sounds like Starship would come back in an enormous distance away from Starbase. But there's an important distinction here. Those 22 degrees don't mean Starship would simply be 22 degrees of latitude away from Starbase. Starbase is already located around 26 degrees north, and SpaceX can choose the orbital inclination and trajectory to work with that location. The shape and angle of the orbit, along with the curvature of the Earth, all affect where Starship actually ends up relative to the launch site. So the real separation can be much smaller than that 22-degree number makes it sound. So, a one-orbit return isn't necessarily impossible. If Starship has enough cross-range capability, it could potentially make the necessary adjustment during atmospheric entry and still reach the catch area. And there's an important difference between two kinds of movement here. Cross-range means moving sideways relative to that trajectory, while downrange means continuing farther in the direction you're already traveling. Starship has already demonstrated that it can control its flight path and extend its range downrange. But moving hundreds of miles sideways is a much bigger ask. At orbital velocity, you're moving ridiculously fast, so making a major sideways adjustment takes a lot of energy, and that energy ultimately comes out of your propellant budget. That's why Starship's previous controlled entry demonstrations are so important. Every one of those flights is basically teaching SpaceX how much authority the vehicle actually has once it comes screaming back through the atmosphere. But if the one-orbit geometry doesn't work, Starship has another option. Just stay in orbit longer. Because Earth keeps rotating underneath the orbital plane, the position of Starbase relative to Starship's orbit changes over time. Eventually, the geometry may become much more favorable for a deorbit burn back toward the launch site. And Flight 14 adds another complication. Starship is supposed to deploy operational Starlink satellites during the mission, so it can't simply reach orbit and immediately start worrying about coming home. It first has to stabilize itself, deploy the satellites, perform whatever orbital maneuvers are required, and then prepare for re-entry. If getting back to Starbase requires a large dogleg maneuver, basically a major change in trajectory, that costs propellant. And every kilogram of propellant used to move sideways is propellant that can't be used for something else. There's another interesting consequence if the catch requires several orbits. That could turn Flight 14 into Starship's first real long-duration cryogenic test in orbit. Starship uses liquid methane and liquid oxygen, which are stored at extremely cold temperatures. Keeping those propellants usable for a couple of hours is one thing. Keeping them ready for many hours, or potentially an entire day, is much harder. Now you're dealing with propellant boil-off, tank heating, pressure management, propellant settling, engine restart conditions, thermal control, spacecraft attitude, power consumption, and guidance and navigation over a much longer mission. So a first catch attempt that lasts 24 hours isn't simply a longer version of the same test. It would be testing an entirely new set of capabilities. And that's exactly why SpaceX would probably prefer the one-orbit option if the trajectory allows it. Starship only needs to survive for roughly 1 to 2 hours. The ground team gets a much more predictable timeline, and Mechazilla doesn't have to sit there waiting half a day like it's waiting for that one friend of y'all who always said, "I'll be there in 5 minutes." But ultimately, the orbital trajectory gets the final vote. Eventually, Florida is going to make this whole problem a lot easier. Right now, Starbase is sitting near the southern tip of Texas, which is great for developing Starship, but it's not exactly surrounded by empty ocean. When you launch from South Texas, the trajectory has to be carefully designed around populated areas and the geography of the region. You can't just point the rocket wherever you want and hope everyone underneath has a really good umbrella. Florida is a different story. From Cape Canaveral, a rocket can head out over the Atlantic almost immediately. That gives SpaceX much more freedom to reach a wider range of orbital inclinations without having to send the vehicle over large areas of land. And that becomes increasingly important as Starship moves from experimental test flights toward regular orbital operations. So, in the future, the two launch sites will play very different roles. Starbase could remain the place where SpaceX does most of its Starship development, testing, and missions that work well with the trajectories available from South Texas. Meanwhile, Florida could become the more flexible launch site for operational missions requiring a wider range of orbital inclinations. Anyway, let's get back to the flight because it is time for the catch. Coming back from orbit is where things get really serious. Starship will hit the atmosphere at nearly 7.8 kilometers per second. The booster, by comparison, is only traveling at a few kilometers per second when it starts its return. That means ship has an enormous amount of energy to get rid of before it can even think about lining itself up with a tower. And there are a lot of opportunities for things to go wrong. If the heat shield loses too many tiles, parts of the vehicle that really don't enjoy being cooked could start overheating. If Starship's attitude is even slightly off during re-entry, its entire flight path can change. And if the timing is wrong by just a few seconds, Mechazilla isn't catching a spacecraft. It's catching absolutely nothing. Flight 13 was encouraging, though. The ship demonstrated extremely precise guidance and navigation throughout its flight, following the planned trajectory all the way through the landing phase. So, from a flight control perspective, SpaceX has already demonstrated a lot of what it needs. But there's still one particularly important piece of the puzzle. As Starship comes down, its Raptor engines need to reliably restart after spending a long time in space. Those engines then have to produce exactly the right amount of thrust at exactly the right moment to flip the vehicle, slow it down, and put it in position for the catch. So yeah, this is definitely not going to be easy. But if Ship 41 actually comes screaming back from orbit and those giant chopsticks close around it on the first attempt, that would be one hell of a way to end Flight 14. As we get toward the end, there's one more question. Will SpaceX try to catch Booster 21 as well? Well, we actually have a pretty good clue. In an application for Special Temporary Authority covering Flight 14, SpaceX described the mission as having the first stage booster return to the launch site. So, at least according to the current plan, it looks like Booster 21 is supposed to come back for a catch too. And honestly, that would be awesome. But I also wouldn't be shocked if SpaceX changed its mind at the last minute. The booster still has plenty to prove, and SpaceX doesn't necessarily need to recover it at all costs. If they have to choose between saving the booster and getting Ship 41 through its first orbital mission, the ship is probably the more important prize. So if SpaceX decides that Booster 21 is expendable, it wouldn't necessarily mean something went wrong. They could simply decide that sacrificing the booster gives them a better chance of getting the more important data from Ship. That said, booster reuse is still incredibly valuable. Every booster SpaceX successfully recovers is one less booster it has to manufacture from scratch. And that becomes a huge deal if Starship eventually reaches the launch cadence SpaceX is aiming for. If Starship eventually flies dozens or even hundreds of times, recovering the hardware isn't just a cool party trick anymore. It's one of the things that could make the entire system economically viable. So, Booster 21, catch? No catch? Let me know which one you think is better in the comments. So, now you know why I said Starship Flight 14 is unlike any other Starship mission before it. One of the hardest parts isn't simply figuring out whether Starship can physically go around Earth and come back. Starship has to be in exactly the right place relative to a constantly rotating Earth, while staying inside its approved flight corridors, carrying its payload, managing its propellant, and proving that the vehicle can survive a much longer orbital mission. And then, after all of that, it still has to come back through the atmosphere and deal with an entirely new set of challenges just to get into position for the catch. So yeah, there's a lot that can go wrong. But it's not impossible. And that's what makes Flight 14 so important. If SpaceX eventually wants Starship to fly every few days, or even more frequently, they can't treat every mission like a one-off stunt. They need to figure out how to make the entire process reliable and repeatable. Flight 14 is basically a test of whether Starship can take that next big step.